December 1942. The Don Steppes, bound by frost and covered with snow, became the arena for one of the most dramatic battles of the Great Patriotic War. On November 23rd, Soviet troops closed the encirclement around the 6th Army of Colonel General Friedrich Paulus. 22 divisions, about 300,000 soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht, found themselves in the steel ring. Stalingrad, for which they had been fighting since summer, turned into a trap for the elite German troop grouping. The city on the Volga held colossal strategic importance for both sides. For Hitler, the key to the oil fields of the Caucasus and a symbol of personal triumph over the city bearing Stalin's name. For the Soviet Union, the last frontier on the Germans' path to vital transport arteries and a symbol of resilience. Now the situation had drastically changed. Paulus's encircled grouping was losing combat effectiveness daily. Air supply did not cover minimal needs. A critical task arose for the German command: to de-blockade the surrounded troops at any cost, or lose not only the army, but also strategic initiative on the entire Eastern Front. November 23, 1942, marked a turning point for the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. The triumphant offensive launched in the summer turned into a strategic catastrophe. Paulus's 6th Army, the pride of the German armed forces, found itself trapped in the Stalingrad cauldron. 22 divisions, about 300,000 men, hundreds of tanks and guns, transformed from an offensive fist into a helpless garrison, cut off from the main forces. Hitler's reaction to the encirclement was typical: a refusal to acknowledge reality and a belief in solving the problem with half measures. The Führer categorically forbade Paulus from breaking out of the encirclement in the first days, when the Soviet ring was not yet strong enough. Instead, a disastrous option was chosen: supplying the encircled group by air. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal and commander of the Luftwaffe, self-confidently promised to ensure the delivery of at least 500 tons of cargo daily. Reality proved much harsher. Germany's transport aviation was not prepared for such a task. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns, bad weather, and colossal distances turned the air bridge into a thin thread. On the best days, just over 100 tons were delivered to the cauldron. On the worst, no supplies arrived at all. In the first weeks of the encirclement, the 6th Army still maintained its combat capability. Soldiers believed in a swift relief, and commanders upheld discipline. But each day brought deterioration. Fuel ran out, equipment broke down, ammunition had to be conserved, and food rations reduced. By mid-December, the bread norm for soldiers dropped to 200 grams per day. The first cases of dystrophy and frostbite began. The medical situation became catastrophic. The wounded died without proper care, and unsanitary conditions led to outbreaks of infectious diseases. The morale of the encircled troops gradually declined. Although outwardly, discipline was maintained with an iron fist by the military police. At meetings at the Führer's headquarters, the question of saving the 6th Army caused fierce debates. Chief of the General Staff of the Army, Colonel General Kurt Zeitzler, insisted on an immediate relief. Hitler, however, urged on by Göring, continued to believe in the possibility of air supply. Precious time was running out, and the Soviet command methodically strengthened both the inner and outer fronts of the encirclement. On November 21, 1942, as the encirclement ring around the 6th Army was just closing, the Wehrmacht High Command decided to create a new operational structure: Army Group Don. At its head was placed one of the most talented German military leaders, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, urgently transferred from the Leningrad front. The choice was not accidental. Manstein had a reputation as a master of strategic maneuvers and complex operations. It was he who was to solve the seemingly impossible task: to save Paulus's encircled army. The Field Marshal arrived at the Army Group headquarters in Novocherkassk on November 27th, when the situation was already critical. Assessing the situation, Manstein concluded that a concentrated strike by mobile formations from the south would be required for the relief. Thus was born the plan for Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. Manstein's concept was elegant in its simplicity: to deliver a powerful tank blow from the Kotelnikovo area in the direction of Stalingrad, break through the outer front of the encirclement, and create a corridor to the encircled grouping. Simultaneously, Paulus's Sixth Army was to deliver a counterblow from within the cauldron. To implement the plan, the Field Marshal requested significant reinforcements, no less than 6 fresh divisions, including 3 tank divisions. However, the Wehrmacht's resources on the Eastern Front were already exhausted, and Hitler could allocate only a portion of the requested forces. The main striking force of the relief operation was the 4th Panzer Army under the command of Colonel General Hermann Hoth. A key role in it was played by General Kirchner's 57th Panzer Corps, reinforced by the 6th Panzer Division, which had arrived from France. Manstein understood that time was working against him. Every day of delay strengthened the Soviet defense and weakened the encircled grouping. Nevertheless, preparing the operation required time. It was necessary to concentrate troops, provide them with fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Initially, the start of the operation was planned for early December, but constant delays in the arrival of reinforcements forced it to be postponed until December 12th. In his calculations, Manstein proceeded from the assumption that the Soviet command had not yet managed to create a strong defense on the outer front of the encirclement. He counted on the advantage of German tank units in maneuver warfare in open terrain. The emphasis was placed on speed, surprise, and concentration of forces on a narrow breakthrough sector. By December 1942, the German command had allocated significant forces for the relief strike on Stalingrad, though fewer than Manstein had requested. The core of the strike group was the 4th Panzer Army, under Colonel General Hermann Hoth. The main striking force was the 57th Panzer Corps, under General Friedrich Kirchner, which included the 6th, 17th, and 23rd Panzer Divisions. Of particular value was the 6th Panzer Division, transferred from France and having a full complement of equipment and personnel. In total, the Corps numbered about 230 tanks, including the latest modifications of T3 and T4, with reinforced armor and improved armament. Support for the tank units was provided by the Großdeutschland Motorized Division and Romanian formations, although the latter had low combat effectiveness after their recent defeat. Air cover was provided by the 4th Air Fleet, but its capabilities were limited due to the need to support the air bridge to Paulus's encircled group. The Soviet command countered the German group with troops from the 2nd Guards Army, under General Malinovsky, and the 51st Army, under General Kreiser. The 2nd Guards, hastily transferred from the Caucasus, consisted of fresh, well-equipped formations with high morale. These armies numbered about 250 tanks, predominantly T-34s and light T-70s. In terms of artillery, Soviet troops significantly outnumbered German units. A significant advantage for the Soviet side was the ability to create an echeloned defense, with pre-prepared positions and anti-tank areas. German troops, on the contrary, experienced serious problems with logistics. Stretched communications, a shortage of winter uniforms, limited fuel supplies. All this reduced the strike potential of Hoth's group. Each tank could count on only 1 or 2 ammunition loads and a limited fuel supply. The issue of repairing and evacuating damaged equipment in the conditions of the winter steppe was particularly acute. Soviet troops, on the contrary, relied on closer rear bases and had an established supply system. By the beginning of Operation Winter Storm, the balance of forces in the direction of the main strike was roughly equal in tanks, but with an advantage for the Soviet side in infantry, artillery, and aviation. However, the The main factor that determined the outcome of the operation was not so much quantitative as qualitative. German troops were advancing with limited resources, while the Soviets were defending prepared positions, with the ability to maneuver reserves.
December 5, 1942.
In the snow-covered Don Steppe, a drama unfolded that would determine the fate not only of the Sixth Army, but of the entire Eastern Front. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, having been appointed commander of Army Group Don, immediately established contact with the encircled Paulus. The radio messages between the two commanders during these days were full of tension and hidden disagreements. Manstein was a pragmatist. He understood that the success of the winter storm relief operation was possible only with active engagement from both sides. Therefore, on December 11th, he sent Paulus a directive to prepare a counterattack. Operation Donnerschlag, Thunderclap. The plan stipulated that at the moment Goth's tanks approached the pocket, the Sixth Army was to launch a powerful strike from within the encirclement, linking up with the relief forces. However, the implementation of this plan faced a critical problem: a catastrophic shortage of fuel inside the pocket. By mid-December, the fuel reserves of the encircled group allowed tanks to cover no more than 30 kilometers. Yet, the breakthrough distance required a minimum of 50 kilometers of travel. Paulus, upon receiving Manstein's directive, found himself in an agonizing dilemma. In his reply, he reported, "The army is ready for a breakthrough, but the critical shortage of fuel makes it impossible to carry out the operation in full. For a counterattack, a minimum of 1,800 tons of fuel is needed." This amount was absolutely unattainable given the existing capabilities of the air bridge. Against the backdrop of this correspondence, Hitler continued to insist on holding all positions in Stalingrad. His directive of December 8th categorically forbade any reduction of the defensive perimeter, which deprived Paulus of the opportunity to concentrate forces for a breakthrough.
The commander of the Sixth Army found himself caught between contradictory orders.
Manstein demanded preparation for a breakthrough, Hitler to stand to the last. Paulus, an impeccable serviceman, dared not act against the direct orders of the Führer. Instead of concentrating forces for a strike, he dispersed the remaining fuel and ammunition to hold the perimeter, which became increasingly unstable each day under the blows of Soviet troops. Manstein, understanding the criticality of the situation, tried to convince the High Command to allow the Sixth Army to begin preparations for a breakthrough immediately, without waiting for the relief forces to arrive. But his arguments were shattered by Hitler's unyielding stubbornness, who saw any retreat as a sign of weakness. Time was working against the German command. Every day of delay meant a reduction in fuel and ammunition reserves in the pocket, a strengthening of Soviet defenses, and a decrease in the chances of a successful relief. Paulus, once a decisive commander, increasingly plunged into fatalism, expecting salvation from the outside, instead of preparing a breakthrough from within.
December 12, 1942.
A frosty morning. The thermometers showed -20 degrees. Fog spread over the snow-covered steppe. At 7:30, the silence was shattered by the roar of artillery preparation. Operation Winterstorm had begun. General Kirchner's 57th Panzer Corps moved into the offensive from the Kotelnikovo bridgehead. At the vanguard was the 6th Panzer Division, an elite formation transferred from France specifically for this operation. Tanks with black crosses on their sides methodically overcame the first line of Soviet defense. German tactics had been honed by years of war. A concentrated strike on a narrow sector, a breakthrough, and then an expansion of the breach to bring in the main forces. Soviet screens from units of the 51st Army offered fierce resistance, but could not restrain the might of the Wehrmacht's armored fist. By the end of the first day of the operation, German tanks had advanced 23 kilometers deep into Soviet defenses. Field Marshal Manstein, commander of Army Group Don, was cautiously optimistic. In his report to the Führer's headquarters, he noted, "The first day of the offensive was successful. The enemy's first line of defense has been breached. Losses are within expected limits." The Soviet command reacted to the breakthrough immediately. The Stavka of the Supreme High Command ordered the acceleration of the transfer of General Malinovsky's Second Guards Army. Simultaneously, mobile blocking detachments, reinforced with anti-tank artillery, were deployed to contain the German advance. On December 13th and 14th, the offensive continued. German tank divisions, despite increasing resistance, advanced another 40 kilometers. Particularly fierce battles unfolded for the crossings over the Oxay River. Soviet units blew up bridges and mined approaches, but the 6th Panzer Division, acting decisively, managed to seize several crossings. On December 15th, advanced units of the 57th Panzer Corps reached the next waterline, the Mishkova River. Less than 50 kilometers remained to Paulus's encircled group. However, the pace of the offensive began to slow. Stretched communications, a shortage of fuel and ammunition took their toll. In addition, Soviet resistance became increasingly organized with each passing day. More and more anti-tank guns, minefields, and well-camouflaged strongholds appeared in the path of the German tanks. Manstein's radio message flew to Paulus. "The offensive is developing successfully. Prepare for a counterstrike." But inside the cauldron, the situation was becoming increasingly critical. Fuel supplies were dwindling, and the air bridge could not cope with supplying the necessary minimum. Paulus hesitated to prepare for a breakthrough, bound by Hitler's rigid directives. The Soviet command reacted to the start of Operation Winterstorm with lightning speed. Already in the first hours of the German offensive, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command held an emergency meeting. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the Stavka representative on the Stalingrad front, immediately reported to Stalin on the developing situation. The Supreme High Commander made a key decision: to stop Manstein's relief strike at all costs. It was clear that if German tanks managed to break through to Paulus's surrounded group, all the achievements of Operation Uranus would be nullified. The fate of the entire Battle of Stalingrad was at stake. Zhukov personally coordinated the actions of the fronts, maintaining constant communication with army commanders. The most important decision was the urgent transfer of the Second Guards Army under Lieutenant General Rodion Malinovsky from the Caucasian direction. This army, consisting of elite, well-equipped units, was originally intended for a decisive strike against Paulus's encircled group. Now, however, it was redirected to the outer encirclement front. Echelons with troops and equipment moved to the front line amidst a severe shortage of transport. Many units made exhausting forced marches on foot across snow-covered steppes in 30-degree frost. The commander of the Stalingrad front, Colonel General Andrei Eremenko, organized an echeloned defense system in the path of the German tank wedge. The first echelon consisted of mobile blocking detachments with anti-tank artillery and sapper units. Their task was to slow down the advance of German tanks, inflict maximum damage on them, and gain time to prepare the main defense lines. The second echelon was formed from rifle units with artillery anti-tank reserves. Finally, the third echelon included tank and mechanized units, ready for counterattacks. Special attention was paid to the creation of anti-tank areas in key directions. Artillery batteries were located in hidden positions, providing flanking fire on advancing tanks. Sapper units continuously mined roads and probable routes of advance for German equipment. Fighter groups with anti-tank rifles and bottles with incendiary mixture were also widely used to combat tanks. Soviet aviation played a decisive role in containing the German offensive. Despite difficult weather conditions, IL-2 attack aircraft and PE-2 dive bombers struck columns of German equipment, destroying tanks and disrupting the supply of the strike group. The Red Army Command skillfully used the terrain. The Oksai and Mishkova rivers, with their steep banks, became natural defense lines. Engineer troops fortified these positions, creating an insurmountable barrier in the path of German tanks. December 19, 1942. German tank units reached the last serious obstacle on the way to Paulus's encircled grouping, the Mishkova River. This small tributary of the Don, with steep banks, icy in places, snow-covered in others, became the arena for the decisive battle of Operation Winter Storm. Here, on the line 50 kilometers from the outer encirclement ring of Stalingrad, the fate of the entire campaign was being decided. The 6th Panzer Division, the spearhead of Manstein's offensive, reached the river at dawn. Reconnaissance reported that most of the bridges had been blown up, and the opposite bank was fortified with anti-tank guns and machine gun nests. General Kirchner, commander of the 57th Panzer Corps, decided to force the river on the march, without allowing Soviet troops to consolidate their positions. German sappers, under the cover of artillery fire, began to construct crossings. However, the Soviet command was prepared for this moment. At the Mishkova line, the main forces of Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army were deployed. Anti-tank guns were expertly camouflaged, and multi-layered minefields were created in tank-dangerous directions. Artillery was concentrated into powerful anti-tank strongholds, capable of sweeping all approaches to the river. When the first German tanks attempted to cross the water barrier, they came under concentrated fire. Several vehicles were knocked out directly on the crossings. Others, having broken through to the opposite bank, encountered deeply echeloned defenses. Soviet artillerymen fired direct shots, knocking out German tanks one after another. Anti-tank rifles played a special role, with which Soviet soldiers struck the tracks and sides of German vehicles from close range. Fierce battles continued throughout the day. By the evening of December 19th, the Germans managed to establish a small bridgehead on the north bank of the river, but at the cost of significant losses in equipment. On December 20th, the battle resumed with renewed force. The German command threw all available reserves into battle. Tanks and motorized infantry attacked Soviet positions, wave after wave. In some places, they managed to advance several kilometers, but every meter was gained at the cost of enormous effort and losses. Soviet troops, skillfully maneuvering, launched counterattacks on the flanks of the breakthrough groups. December 23, 1942. German tank units, exhausted from battle, halted 50 kilometers from Paulus's encircled group. This distance, which tanks would cover in a few hours in summer conditions, had now turned into an insurmountable chasm. Manstein's group's offensive potential was exhausted. The 6th Panzer Division, a formidable force just recently, had lost more than half of its vehicles. The remaining tanks suffered from technical malfunctions caused by extreme frosts and continuous fighting. Fuel supplies were running low, and stretched communications prevented uninterrupted supply. The Soviet command, accurately assessing the situation, increased pressure on the depleted German grouping. Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army, having entrenched itself on the northern bank of the Mishkova, switched from defense to active operations. Its units delivered flank attacks, threatening to cut off advanced German units from the main forces. Simultaneously, units of the 51st Army exerted pressure from the east. A somber mood prevailed at the headquarters of Army Group Don. Manstein, soberly assessing the situation, understood that Operation Winterstorm had reached a dead end. Even if it were possible to advance a few more kilometers, there were no longer enough forces to hold the corridor to the encircled group. Moreover, the situation was complicated by threatening events on the Middle Don, where Soviet troops had broken through the defenses of Italian units and were rapidly advancing into the rear of Army Group Don. In his diary, the Chief of Staff of the Army Group wrote, "Our tanks see Stalingrad, but it is no longer possible to reach it. We stand before a choice: to continue a hopeless offensive or to save the entire army group from encirclement. On December 23rd, Manstein spent several hours at the map, analyzing possible courses of action. Every scenario led to one conclusion. The continuation of Operation Winterstorm threatened catastrophe for the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. Late in the evening, a directive was sent to the headquarters of the 4th Panzer Army. Cease active offensive operations. Switch to defense on the achieved lines. For Paulus's 6th Army, this meant the final verdict. The 50 kilometers separating it from the relief forces became a symbol of the Wehrmacht's limits on the Eastern Front. These 50 kilometers of snow-covered steppe, strewn with knocked-out tanks and the bodies of the fallen, clearly demonstrated that the strategic initiative had finally passed to the Red Army. On December 16, 1942, as Manstein's tanks were engaged in heavy fighting on the approaches to Mishkova, Operation Little Saturn began on the Middle Don. Soviet command delivered a powerful blow against the positions of the Italian 8th Army and the German Army Corps. This strategic maneuver fundamentally altered the entire situation on the southern flank of the Eastern Front and predetermined the fate of Operation Winter Storm. The strike was carried out by forces of the Southwestern Front under the command of Colonel General Nikolai Vatutin and part of the forces of the Voronezh Front. On the very first day of the offensive, the defenses of the Italian divisions were breached on a wide front. Poorly trained and ill-equipped for winter warfare, the Italian units could not withstand the onslaught of Soviet tanks and infantry. By the end of December 18th, a gap 100 kilometers wide and up to 40 kilometers deep had formed in the enemy's defenses. Manstein received increasingly alarming reports from the northern flank of his army group. Italian units were retreating in panic, exposing the flank and rear of the entire grouping engaged in the relief of Stalingrad. Mobile Soviet formations surged into the breach, threatening to cut off the main communications of Army Group Don. Under these circumstances, the Field Marshal faced an extremely difficult dilemma. Should he continue Operation Winterstorm, throwing all forces into breaking through to Paulus, or urgently redeploy units to close the gap in the north? The first option offered a phantom chance to relieve the 6th Army, but created the threat of encirclement for the entire Army Group Don. The second meant the de facto abandonment of Paulus's rescue, but preserved the main forces for stabilizing the front. On December 21st, a coded message flew to the Führer's headquarters. The situation of the Army Group is critical. Italian units are completely routed. The enemy has broken through to the rear of the 4th Panzer Army. To prevent disaster, it is necessary to urgently redeploy forces from the Kotelnikovo direction to close the gap. Hitler, upon receiving Manstein's report, realized the scale of the threat for the first time. The loss of the 6th Army was a severe blow, but the complete defeat of Army Group Don would mean the collapse of the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front and would open the way for Soviet troops to Rostov-on-Don and further into Ukraine. On December 22nd, Manstein made his final decision. The tank divisions, which just yesterday were rushing towards Stalingrad, received orders to turn around and urgently move north to counter the Soviet offensive. Operation Winterstorm was effectively concluded, having failed to achieve its goal. December 23, 1942. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein stood over a map in his headquarters, located in a small Don Cossack village. His face, usually impenetrable, betrayed extreme tension. The map clearly depicted a dramatic situation. A tank wedge, aimed at Stalingrad, had stalled 50 kilometers from its objective, while from the north, like an avalanche, a Soviet offensive was advancing, threatening to cut off the entire Army Group Don. 50 kilometers, such a close and yet so unattainable distance. At this moment, Manstein was making perhaps the most difficult decision of his military career. A direct telephone conversation with Hitler took place on the evening of December 23rd. The Führer was in his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, thousands of kilometers from the dramatic events on the Don. "My Führer!" Manstein's voice sounded unusually strained. "Operation Winterstorm has reached its limit. We are stopped 50 kilometers from Stalingrad. Further advance is impossible without reinforcements, which we do not have." At the same time, the Soviet offensive on the Middle Don threatens the rear of the entire army group. Hitler was silent, and in that silence, Manstein decided on something that a week ago would have seemed unthinkable. "I request permission to order the Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement to meet our troops. This is the only chance to save at least the men, if not the equipment." The final days of December 1942 became a time of fading hopes for the encircled Sixth Army. News of the cessation of Operation Wintergewitter reached Paulus's headquarters on December 24th. It was a cruel Christmas gift for the encircled troops. Colonel General Paulus, upon receiving the radio message, sat motionless for a long time in his bunker, located in the basement of a ruined department store. His adjutant later recalled, "He seemed to have turned to stone. Only his fingers, nervously tapping on the map, betrayed the storm of emotions raging within." The commander of the Sixth Army understood. Their fate was now sealed. The 50 kilometers separating Manstein's tanks from the pocket became an insurmountable chasm. Soviet troops methodically tightened the encirclement. By the end of December, the defense perimeter had shrunk to 40 kilometers in width and 20 in depth. Each day brought the loss of several more strongholds. Particularly heavy fighting took place in the area of Potomnik Airfield, the last major site for receiving transport aircraft. On January 16th, Soviet troops captured Potomnik, and air supply became practically impossible. The food situation became catastrophic. The daily ration for soldiers was reduced to 100 grams of bread and a small portion of horse meat. Thousands of people suffered from dystrophy. One field hospital doctor wrote in his diary, "Soldiers look like walking skeletons. Many cannot hold their weapons due to weakness. Scurvy and dysentery mow down people no worse than Soviet shells." Ammunition was conserved with maniacal meticulousness. Artillery could only fire in critical situations. Tanks, immobilized due to lack of fuel, turned into fixed firing points. Medical support practically collapsed. Thousands of wounded accumulated in field hospitals. Without medicines, bandages, and anesthetics, doctors were powerless to help most of them. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, often with an ordinary hacksaw. Mortality among the wounded reached 70%. The morale of the encircled troops steadily declined. Cases of suicide among officers and desertion among privates became more frequent. German military police acted with extreme brutality, shooting on the spot anyone suspected of attempting to surrender. But even these measures could not stop the decomposition of a once elite army. Paulus, understanding the hopelessness of the situation, several times requested permission from Hitler to capitulate. The answer was unchanging. The Sixth Army will fulfill its duty to the end. Every day of resistance is a contribution to the general victory. In late January 1943, Soviet troops launched a decisive offensive, cutting the pocket into two parts. The agony of the Sixth Army was coming to an end. Operation Winterstorm stands as a vivid illustration of how even a brilliant military design can be doomed to failure due to a complex array of strategic and tactical errors. Analyzing the reasons behind Manstein's defeat, we can identify several key factors. First and foremost, the forces allocated for the relief effort proved catastrophically insufficient. 3 tank divisions, even reinforced with infantry units, could not accomplish a task of such magnitude in winter conditions against a prepared defense. For comparison, during the breakout from the Demyansk pocket in February 1942, the Germans used twice as many forces on a significantly smaller sector of the front. Manstein requested a minimum of 6 divisions but received only half. The delayed start of the operation also proved to be a fatal error. Initially, the relief was planned to begin in early December, but due to delays in transferring reinforcements, it only commenced on the 12th. During these critical days, Soviet command managed to significantly strengthen the outer encirclement front and transfer fresh forces. The third factor was the catastrophic lack of coordination between Manstein and Paulus. Operation Winterstorm was initially conceived as a pincer movement, Hoth's tanks breaking through from the outside, and the Sixth Army striking from within the pocket. However, Paulus, constrained by Hitler's rigid directives, was unable to prepare his troops for a breakout. Moreover, the Sixth Army continued to hold a vast perimeter instead of concentrating forces on the southwestern direction. The failure of the Luftwaffe to provide air support cannot be overlooked either. The Fourth Air Fleet, exhausted by attempts to supply the encircled group, could not provide reliable cover for the advancing tank units. Soviet aviation, on the contrary, acted increasingly actively, striking at Hoth's group's communications. The overestimation of the capabilities of tank formations in winter conditions also played a fatal role. Equipment constantly broke down due to frost, and fuel consumption in deep snow exceeded all norms. Alternative relief options existed, but all of them required either a greater number of forces or an earlier start to the operation. The most promising might have been an attack not from the south, but from the west, from Morozovskaya through Tormosin. This direction was shorter, and the Soviet defense there was weaker. However, such an option required the transfer of significant forces from other sectors of the front, which Hitler refused to do. Ultimately, Operation Winter Storm became a striking example of how strategic miscalculations by the High Command and inflexibility in decision-making can negate even the most talented tactical designs. The victory of Soviet troops in the confrontation with Manstein's group was not accidental. It was the result of the masterful command of military art demonstrated by the Soviet command in organizing the defense on the outer encirclement front. A key role in this success was played by reconnaissance, which timely detected the preparation of the German counteroffensive. Aerial and agent intelligence accurately identified the areas of concentration of enemy tank divisions, their routes of advance, and the approximate timing of the operation's start. This allowed the Soviet command to prepare in advance to repel the relief strike. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who coordinated the actions of the fronts, decided to transfer the Second Guards Army of General Rodion Malinovsky from the Caucasus direction. This army, staffed with experienced soldiers and commanders, became the main force that blocked the path of Manstein's tank divisions. It is particularly noteworthy that the transfer was carried out in the most severe winter conditions, with temperatures dropping to 30 degrees below zero. Many units marched 50 to 60 kilometers a day to occupy defensive lines in time. The commander of the Stalingrad front, General Andrei Yeremenko, brilliantly organized the engineering preparation of the terrain. The Oksai and Mishkova rivers with their steep banks became natural anti-tank barriers. Engineer units continuously mined tank-dangerous directions around the clock, installing up to 2,000 mines per day. False positions were created, attracting the fire of German aviation and artillery, while the real defensive lines remained untouched. The Soviet command masterfully applied the principles of mobile defense. Instead of creating a continuous front line that German tanks could break through with a concentrated strike, a system of strongholds with mobile reserves was organized. Anti-tank artillery was located in hidden positions, providing flanking fire. When German tanks broke through between strongholds, they came under crossfire from the flanks and strikes from mobile anti-tank reserves from the rear. General Malinovsky proved himself to be a talented tactician, skillfully distributing forces along directions. He deliberately weakened secondary sectors, creating a powerful fist in the main direction of the German tank attack. When the 6th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht reached the Mishkova River, it was met by a real wall of fire. The commander of the 51st Army, General Nikolai Trufanov, organized an effective system of artillery fire in which every square kilometer was cross-fired by at least 2 batteries. A special role was played by anti-tank reserves, which were transferred to threatened directions within a few hours. Tank brigades, covertly concentrated in ravines and gullies, delivered unexpected counterattacks on the flanks of the breakthrough German units. Soviet commanders demonstrated an excellent understanding of the enemy's psychology. Knowing about the critical situation of Paulus's encircled group, they correctly assessed that Manstein would strive for the fastest possible advance, sacrificing the security of the flanks. This was used to deliver flanking strikes, which forced the German command to disperse its forces. The failure of Operation Winter Storm had an enormous historical significance, far exceeding the scope of a local defeat of German troops. This event became a turning point, not only for the Battle of Stalingrad, but for the entire Second World War. Manstein's inability to cover 50 crucial kilometers symbolized the exhaustion of the Wehrmacht's offensive potential on the Eastern Front. The strategic initiative irrevocably passed to the Red Army. After Stalingrad, the German command could never again plan large-scale strategic operations with the same confidence. The Wehrmacht was forced to transition to strategic defense, only occasionally undertaking local counterattacks. The defeat at Stalingrad dealt a crushing blow to Germany's prestige on the international stage. Neutral countries, such as Turkey and Japan, finally abandoned plans to enter the war on the side of the Third Reich. Germany's allies, Italy, Hungary, Romania, began secret negotiations to withdraw from the war. Within Germany itself, the catastrophe of the Sixth Army caused the first serious wave of doubt about final victory. Operation Winter Storm enriched military science with invaluable lessons in the field of relief operations. The main one is the necessity of coordinated actions between encircled troops and the relief force. The lack of coordination between Manstein and Paulus became one of the key reasons for the failure. The second crucial lesson is the critical importance of timeliness. The delay in starting the relief allowed the Soviet command to create a powerful, echeloned defense. The third lesson concerns the sufficiency of forces. To break through a prepared defense, a multiple superiority in the breakthrough sector is required, which Manstein did not possess. Soviet military art demonstrated the effectiveness of deeply echeloned anti-tank defense with active maneuver of reserves. This model was later successfully applied in the defense of the Kursk salient. The experience of Stalingrad also proved the critical importance of air superiority in conducting relief operations. The Luftwaffe's inability to provide reliable cover for advancing tank units was one of the factors in the failure. For modern military science, the events of the winter of '42 retain their relevance as a classic example of a complex strategic operation, where not only the balance of forces but also factors of time, space, weather, morale, and logistics play a decisive role. The 50 kilometers that Manstein's tanks could not overcome became a symbolic line, beyond which began the relentless movement of the Third Reich towards defeat.